Don't let it go, don't let it fade. Always have hope in your heart.
Hello folks, how you doing? Welcome to another episode of Local Voices, Different Perspectives. I'm doing something a wee bit different this week, doing a little intro video and an outro, and I'll explain the reasons why. A very special guest was covering so many topics and so many themes that I felt that it was important to split this interview in particular into two parts, not least because a special guest is in fact a Member of Parliament, and we are in fact coming up to election time as well. So I felt that it was important that this perspective be given ample time, and that the local community be given ample time to provide their perspective as well. So the themes that John's going to touch on this week include the role of an MSP and the duties that an MSP has to the local community and the people who vote for him, and the balancing act with the duties that he has to Parliament also. John's going to touch on the impact of lockdowns. In fact, that will form the main body of this first instalment, the impact of the lockdowns on children, upon mothers, parents and guardians, homeschooling, churches as well. And John will be weaving the theme of inequality through that, and how COVID and the measures in place may have impacted disproportionately on different groups. John's also going to touch on the new normal and what he thinks may be here to stay, the aspects of the measures that may be with us for some time. Without further ado, we're going to start the interview. Hope you enjoy it, and give a very warm Local Voices welcome to John Mason. Thank you. Hello everyone, thanks very much for tuning in to this week's episode of Local Voices, Different Perspectives. As you can see, I'm joined by a very special guest, someone that we all know from the local area. So without further ado, we're going to introduce John Mason, or rather, he's going to introduce himself.
Well, thanks Andy, thanks for the opportunity to take part. And as you know, my name is John Mason. I live in Burlanark, so I'm always keen to be involved in anything local in the East End of Glasgow. My roots were originally actually from Rutherglen, so that's just outside Glasgow, as people will know. And but I've been living here for 31 years now. And my background, I was originally an accountant, so that's what I trained as. I worked in Glasgow, I worked in London and in Nepal for 3 years.
Oh wow.
And then since then I've been living mainly in the East End, and previously I was a councillor, 2 years I was an MP, and now I'm MSP for the Scottish Parliament.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, well I suppose I've got different roles as an MSP, and it's true of a councillor as well, or an MP, so any of the elected members. Because I'm elected primarily on a party ticket. Most people vote by the party, so I've got responsibility to the party. I've got responsibility to the local community, the people who voted for me, and what they want. And then I've got kind of more of a broader national responsibility, because I'm there in the Scottish Parliament, for example, setting the budget. So we have to try and get a budget that is good for the whole of Scotland, not just for my little bit. And most of the time these don't compete, but sometimes the responsibilities can compete a bit. And so then that can be a challenge for anyone. But you know, for me personally, I mean, I'm not a government minister. I've no desire to be that, or really be a national figure. So I can spend perhaps more time in the community and doing things with and for the community than some other politicians can. I mean, the First Minister obviously has to, you know, do a whole national, let alone international role, as does the Prime Minister for that matter. Whereas a local MSP like myself, you know, I can spend time doing this. For example, I do try and walk around the constituency just so that people can meet me or see me. In normal times, I would be using local pubs, local shops, local churches, visiting maybe local schools, that kind of thing. So I'm very, very keen to be as much as possible, you know, available to people in the constituency. Well, as I understand it, this is a local for local voices and for local people in the East End. And quite frankly, we do not have a lot of local media in the East End of Glasgow. We actually had a debate in Parliament about local newspapers, and we should support local newspapers, which I agree with. But here in the East End of Glasgow, we do not have any local newspapers. And we used to have two that I remember, and now we have none. And that contrasts, some of the rural areas, every village has a newspaper, or at least every town. And then when we go, even a neighbouring constituency, like I mentioned Rutherglen, they've got Rutherglen Reformer. Now, that newspaper is not perfect, but it's good, and you've got local news, the scouts, the churches, the schools, all these kind of things. And I feel we miss out on that in Glasgow, in the East End. So this is different. Not everybody will see this, but it's a new way. It's the way things are going. That we do more digitally, on video, and so on, because we really need to build the sense of community. And perhaps especially because of COVID and all of that, there's been good things, but some people have felt very isolated. So I think the more we can connect with people, the better, really.
Aye. No, I couldn't agree with that more, John. It's almost as if it's become a lot harder to do things as we normally would. And if human beings can do anything, it's adapt. And the channel is maybe an expression of that, a means for people to connect. So, thanks very much for coming on. And looking forward to hearing your perspectives. First of all, we've seen a lot of changes since March 2020, and a lot of changes in the local community. But it's one of those situations when you're seeing changes globally, and you're seeing them expressed at the local level. What changes have you seen, John, since March of last year?
Yes, that's quite a big question. Some things haven't changed. People are still going to the shops, they're still walking their dog in the park, they're doing all these things. But clearly a lot of other things have changed. We cannot see family and friends as much. Two of us can meet outside, that's allowed, but so many things are not. And for example, my mother is in a care home, and we are very limited how much we can visit her. Some people cannot visit in care homes at all. The schools have been closed, and the schools are really, really central. I think to every community, but perhaps especially here, because we have many kids are struggling. They have maybe difficult home backgrounds, and the school gives stability, and the teacher is somebody from kind of outside their circle who can be helpful, objective, supportive, all of these kind of things. So I think it's been a great loss that children have not been able to be at school, and that's why I think all of the parties at Holyrood have wanted the kids to get back to school as soon as we possibly could. And I personally, church is a big part of my life, so, and for a number of people that is the case, and they've not been able to go to church, so that's been very disappointing. For other people, it's been the physical exercise, it's been going to the gym, even the bingo for company. A lot of people do like that. And perhaps some things, you could say we've got an alcohol problem. It's good that the pubs have been closed, but at the same time, you and I, and I've often met in a pub, and you can chat, you can relax. So these are just a few of the changes, but there's many, many more.
A lot of changes that are impacting on the local community. And is that a big part of your role just now, to kind of be there for constituents and local people that are feeling this impact, or to be a sounding board? Or?
Yes, sometimes you're right, it is just being a sounding board, and I had a business man I was just doing a Zoom call with, and he had a range of issues, but most of his issues he's actually taking forward himself. And I think he partly just wanted, to kind of talk through some of the issues and think about where he might go with them. And I can help. I can write a letter to his bank or to the council or whatever might be helpful. But sometimes that's right, it's a kind of listening voice. But other people are really, frankly, quite angry. I mean, they might be angry that the schools are closed or the churches are closed, or about their business, because as you know, setting up a business is not an easy thing. And if you pour a lot of your life, and some people it's maybe 5 years to get a business really established, maybe if it's a cafe or a restaurant, they've got to build up a reputation. And for all of that just to stop is, it's a huge thing, and I can understand it's a huge thing for many people's lives. So people are understandably angry that what they have worked for, they're not necessarily blaming anyone, but they're just very upset and seeing like part of their life has just gone away. So in that case, we're trying to help people get grants. Sometimes that has not been an easy process. The council can be very bureaucratic, and not everybody is comfortable dealing with that. So yes, there's been a whole range of things.
It must be quite a position to be in, whereby I'm not sure how many emails you get in the course of a day, but I'm sure it's a lot, John. And you're seeing almost like a tapestry of how people are coping with this. It must. Do you feel a bit sometimes a bit overwhelmed by it, or is it just part of the role that you serve?
Well, both. It is part of the role I serve, but also it can be a bit overwhelming. I mean, as I speak to you, I think I have 140 emails waiting to be dealt with, so I shall blame you.
I'm only 2 of them.
But I shall blame you for not answering all the others for another hour. But joking apart, yes, I mean, we try and prioritise. I've got staff who can help me with routine things. So, for example, if somebody's needing rehousing, that's one of the most common things that people come to me with. Maybe they're overcrowded or antisocial neighbours or that kind of stuff. And then my staff are very good at handling that kind of thing. But if it becomes more, I mean, I keep mentioning schools, but it's a recurring theme. If people are saying, well, why are the schools not open? Then really I kind of need to deal with that myself. It's harder for my staff to deal with that kind of question. And so I try and do that, try and prioritise that kind of issue. If it's from a local constituent. If somebody from Aberdeen, I will try and answer as well, but my main responsibility is for people in the East End. And it's varied over the year of COVID. So to start with, a lot of businesses were in touch about how they could get grants. I think a lot of that has been resolved, although there's some groups like taxi drivers, soft play, who have found it very, very difficult to access grants. So that continues, and then as we've moved into the vaccine, there have been more people in touch about the vaccine. And of course, as soon as it was announced, for example, that 70-year-olds were they would start vaccinating on a certain date, everybody wanted their vaccine on the first day. But for most of these cases, what they did, they took an age range, 75 to 79. They would be vaccinated over maybe a fortnight, and so people had to be patient. And in some cases, many people were patient, are patient, but some people, and sometimes it's not for themselves, it's for an older relative. And of course, I can understand that they are uptight about it.
Do you have people contacting you who are concerned about the vaccine itself? Do you have emails come through regarding that?
I've had a few. I mean, some people latch on to, say, one scientist or one doctor, and so you would get some, for example, doctors are very keen on vitamin D, so they would just push and push for vitamin D. Others, that's right, do have reservations about the vaccines, how they were made, have they been tested enough, these kind of things. And I had these questions as well, but I suppose I'm in the privileged position, I can speak to Jason Leach once a week. I can ask him these questions, and then I can feed that back to the constituents. And that's one of my roles. Not just to give the government line, or the scientist line, I will interpret that in a personal way. But, everybody cannot speak to Jason Leach, despite how available he is, even on off the ball. And so I can ask some of the key questions, as do my colleagues, who's in category 6, that kind of thing. And then I can feed that back to constituents. So that's one of my roles.
That's really interesting. You painted a picture there of you at the local level, working between local people and the government. Is that a fair description?
Yes, I mean, I think that is the role, and to be fair, of all the elected members, I was a councillor for 10 years. I think the councillors have a really important role. They are not well paid. They get paid something like 17,000 a year. Myself and the MPs get paid considerably more than that. So I think that's something we need to resolve, because the councillors, just because there's more of them, they've got a more local area. They are the closest to the community. Now, they're not going to probably deal with as many of the health issues that comes to me, but if it comes to what your park looks like, as we sit here in Tollcross Park, if the bins aren't being emptied, if the roads have got potholes, a lot of that does fall to the councillors. So the councillors are really important people. I enjoyed that role, and each role is slightly different. So at the Scottish Parliament, yes, I've still got the link with the local people, but I've got 70,000 people in my area, so I cannot regularly speak to all of them. And so that I therefore speak to the councillors. They pass things on to me, and I can speak to the government. Obviously, an MP is closer to maybe some of the decisions being made at Westminster. They can ask that.
No, you brought that up, John, and I was reading last week about MPs and MPs representing their constituents' concerns in Westminster, and there's a lot of MPs came out recently and were speaking about the impact of lockdown. And you'd mentioned that at the start of the interview, and guys like Charles Walker's, and it seems as if at the local level there's perhaps a kind of desire of course, they came out of lockdown, but a desire maybe to talk about things, and that there's MPs now in Westminster. Do you sense that within the kind of Scottish government that there's maybe a real desire now to push things on, or how would you describe that?
Yeah, you can come back to me if I've misunderstood your question. I mean, I think there is a desire to. I mean, I think the Scottish Parliament compared to Westminster, just because Scotland is smaller, the Parliament as a whole and the government are closer to the people. There's not the same gap. And so, for example, local colleges have said how easy it is to speak to the Minister for Colleges, compared to at Westminster, you could never speak to the Minister. And that's just a size thing. It's not that one is better than the other. So I think that desire's always been there in Scottish MSPs, Parliament, government, to be close and relate to the people and listen to the people. But if you're thinking of, as we move out of the whole COVID situation, doing things differently, I think there is a desire to do things differently. I think the jury's still out as to how much society will change. But, for example, I think we want a more green recovery, and that phrase has been used quite a lot. And, we have talked about trying to make our lifestyles more environmentally friendly, promoting green spaces, less carbon emissions, all of these kind of things.
You're talking about COVID perhaps being an impetus for change and for change going forward. We've seen a lot of changes this year, and I think there's a lot of feeling in the community now about going back to normal and things kind of returning, things like people going on holiday and things like that. Do you think that we'll entirely go back to normal? Do you think perhaps some things are here to stay that weren't there before COVID?
Yes, I think that's true. I think some things will go back to normal. I'd just, love to go back to the cinema again. It's one of my hobbies, and back to the football, watching Clyde, and some of these kind of things, and certainly church for myself as well. However, I suspect, just like the war changed people, my mother grew up through the war, she was evacuated, that made a permanent change to her life, and that whole generation. They were more, I don't know if frugal's the right word, but more careful because they had lived through rationing. My father grew up through the Depression. His father came back with his pay reduced. These things made a lasting impression, and I think there will be good things come out of this. That for some of us, it will make us think, what is serious in life, and maybe some of the things that the last 10, 20 years we've been all excited about will seem a bit less important, having gone through the COVID thing. So I think there will be a change. In a sense, I'm optimistic that there will be a change in some people's thinking, because I think that will be a good thing. I think we've not always focused on the most important things. But we want to get back to, so much seeing friends, seeing family, going out for meals. And I don't think we know at the moment how some people will go back more quickly to the norm. And some people will be more either scared or hesitant, really.
I know. I think we can see in the media that at times there's hot topics and certain debates, and what I'm seeing just now is a couple of topics that I want to kind of bring up. One is kind of proportionality and whether the measures in place are proportionate. I think, as I said, there's 50 MPs down in Westminster, and you hear different MPs perhaps questioning certain measures. Do you think it's been a proportionate response, the kind of negative impact of the lockdown? Do you think the Scottish Government is getting that balance right?
I think they've tried to. And to be fair, probably both Scottish and Westminster. But I think one of the issues is inequality and poverty and things, because COVID has hit certain parts of society more than others.
No, I'd agree with that, yeah.
And that would certainly apply here in the East End of Glasgow. And people who are on, there's different categories. People on frontline type jobs, which includes shop workers, obviously the NHS, the police. Police are probably relatively well paid, but a lot of shop workers are not, and a lot of other jobs which people have to do. Working in some of the ones working in pubs and hotels and restaurants, the jobs just aren't there anymore. At best, they're furloughed. So it has hit more on people from ethnic minorities, women, and people from poorer backgrounds, who are all likely to be in jobs that are less well paying and are probably less protected. So that's one of the big concerns, and I think that's been recognised, and there's been an attempt to target resources, but not wholly successfully, I would have to say. And so because the schools, for example, have been closed right across the board, and you could argue that highly educated parents who are working at home are better able to support their kids through education. Whereas parents who have had a bad experience themselves at school maybe are not that academically inclined, and especially if they've got a job they've got to go out to, they're a carer in a care home or something, how can they be expected to support their kids so much? So the fear is, and we'll only know this in the future, that the gap between the better off and the less well off, and the more educated and the less well educated.
He's alright, he's alright.
He's after food.
Aye.
He's after food. You see people sitting and think, are you?
He's after fame, that's what he's after.
So I think that there is a concern that some children, the gap, there's been this thing called the Attainment Gap for many years, and we've been trying with some success to close it, but I think the concern is that the COVID will have wiped that out. And some kids will have done very well, because some parents always homeschool, so it's not a new thing, and some parents have done that very well, and the kids will be very motivated. But there will be other kids who have done very little, either they don't have the technology, they don't have space at home, they don't have the inclination, the rest of the family are not encouraging them, all of these things. And the fear is that is going to hit people. Here we are in the East End, so let's be specific. We have got better off areas like Broomhouse and Mount Vernon, and we have got much poorer areas like Kinlahi and Parkhead and things. But it's far from being the case that you can say, well, every kid in Broomhouse and Mount Vernon is doing very well, and every kid in Parkhead is doing very badly. That's not the case. Some of the parents in Parkhead will be much more committed to education than some of the parents in Broomhouse. So it's a difficult one, and I think they've said, the schools, for example, have been closed pretty well nationally at the same time, or open nationally. They've not been done locally in the way that other things have been. And it's difficult to see a way around that, but I fear that some of the young people in the more deprived areas will have struggled.
So, that was John Mason. That comprises the first part of his interview. I really hope you enjoyed it. The topics covered I felt were fantastic, and we build towards next week. But before we do that, let's just briefly go over the topics that John covered. In fact, first of all, a massive thank you to John Mason. It's really encouraging to see a Member of Parliament engage with a channel like this and be prepared to sit down in front of the camera and get his voice out there. I actually found that very inspiring, and I hope that this is something that we can encourage and show across and in other communities as well, so that all the different voices that make up a community, from the guys up top, the decision makers, and local people as well, and have a dialogue about the changes that we see taking place. So well done, John. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Let's briefly touch on the topics that John was digging into. First up is the role of a Member of Parliament at this time. John was talking about the duties that he has to the local people, the people who vote for him, and the duties that he has to Parliament as well. He was explaining about Nicola Sturgeon's role being slightly different, but she has a duty to the nation, and then duties on an international basis as well. It's quite interesting. What's your opinion on that? What is the proper balance in this regard? And what comment would you have on the role of an MSP or an MP or any Member of Parliament going forward at this time? Next up was the impact of lockdown on young people and parents, essentially the family unit. John described how many people were handling the measures in place and how they were coping with it. So we would like to know on Local Voices, how have you been coping? What's your experience been with homeschooling? And do you agree with John that in parts at least the success of homeschooling is down to the certain qualities or conditions related to the home and to the parent? The socio-economic factor in homeschooling was something that was touched on by John, and I found that really interesting when he was talking about how different groups have been impacted disproportionately, and it brought back to mind that phrase that was very common at one point about how there'll be winners and losers in this whole situation. Some people will be okay, whilst others won't be. In fact, some aspects of society will absolutely thrive, and others will be left behind. What's your opinion on this, about how the measures that are in place impact disproportionately in the theme of inequality? Provide us your perspective, please. John also spoke about the impact of lockdown in other sections of society. He's talking about the churches being closed and how that's impacted himself, being a big part of John's life. At the time that we were speaking, there was a challenge going through from Church Scotland and other groups with regard to the measures that were put on them by the Scottish Government. And in the time that we've been editing, we've received a decision on that. So it'd be really great if anyone wanted to share their perspective on that and how they feel the measures being introduced to the church have been felt, and how you've been coping with this impact. Amongst all the disruption to what we would term our normal lives, John was voicing the opinion and the perspective that some things are just here to stay. Some aspects of the measures that are in place will perhaps always be with us. What's your opinion on that? The masks, the social distancing, are these things that we should carry forward? It'd be really great to hear people's perspectives on that. Okay, so that's the first part over with. Thanks very much for tuning in. We're very much looking forward to hearing your perspectives, and if you could please share this video, that'd be fantastic. We can attract more members, we can get more voices involved and more perspectives. So if you could share this video as much as possible, I would really appreciate that. Before you go, I'm just going to touch on the topics that we're going to touch next week. We briefly touched on them just now. On the subject of inequality and things changing. John was speaking about a green recovery and how a green recovery is the way that the governments of the world want to move out of this situation. So we touched on the Great Reset, and we're going to be digging into that in much more detail next week. The hot topic, the vaccinations, we were speaking about this as well. We'll be speaking about that a lot in next week's interview, some ethical issues around it. COVID passports, whether we're going to see COVID passports in the UK and Scotland until Crossroads. So we'll be discussing that next week as well. So Join us next week for what will be a fantastic interview, and I really hope you enjoyed this one. Let's get the discussion going, and I look forward to hearing your voices on Local Voices, Different Perspectives. Thank you.